Across hospitals, laboratories, remote villages, and sealed investigation files, there are real cases where careful analysis produced data, but no clear answers. Survivors lived through events considered impossible, patients displayed conditions medicine cannot fully explain, and historical incidents left behind evidence that still challenges modern understanding. These are documented events studied for years yet still unresolved. In this video, we'll break down 7 real cases that science still cannot explain. The man who survived a railroad spike through his skull. In the early afternoon of September 13th, 1848, a railroad construction crew was working outside the small town of Cavendish, Vermont. The Rutland and Burlington Railroad was expanding, and the work required blasting through layers of rock along the track line. The crew followed a routine procedure, drilling holes into stone, filling them with explosive powder, inserting a fuse, and sealing the charge with sand using a long iron tamping rod. The foreman supervising the operation that day was a 25-year-old man named Phineas Gage. According to employment records and witness accounts, Gage was considered capable and disciplined. His employers described him as responsible, organized, and trusted to manage the team. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the crew prepared another blast. The process appeared normal, but at some point the sequence was interrupted. Reports differ slightly, but investigators later concluded that sand had not yet been poured over the powder when Gage began tamping the charge with the iron rod. The rod, measuring over 3 feet long and weighing around 13 pounds, struck the rock and created a spark. The powder ignited instantly. The explosion propelled the iron rod upward like a projectile. It entered Gage's face below his left cheekbone, passed behind his left eye, and traveled through the front of his brain before exiting through the top of his skull. The rod continued into the air and landed several yards away, reportedly covered in blood and brain tissue. The crew members nearby believed Gage had died immediately. Instead, something unexpected happened. Witnesses later testified that Gage was thrown onto his back, but began moving within seconds. He reportedly spoke within minutes of the accident. One worker ran to summon Dr. Edward H. Williams, the first physician to arrive at the scene. Williams later wrote that he initially did not believe the extent of the injury described to him. When he arrived, Gage was sitting upright in an ox cart that had been prepared to transport him to town. Williams later recorded that Gage greeted him calmly and said, "Doctor, here is business enough for you." Blood flowed heavily from the wound, and portions of brain tissue were visible, yet Gage remained conscious. He was transported to a nearby boarding house where another physician, Dr. John Martin Harlow, began treating him. Harlow documented the case carefully in medical reports that would later become one of the most studied neurological cases in history. According to Harlow's notes, Gage remained alert and able to speak during the initial examination. The left side of his face was severely damaged, and a large opening was visible at the top of his skull. The tamping iron had created a channel through the frontal region of his brain. In the following days, Gage's condition fluctuated. Infection developed, and at one point Harlow believed he would not survive. Large abscesses formed around the wound, and portions of damaged tissue were removed. Despite this, Gage gradually began recovering. Within weeks, he could walk. Within months, he was able to travel. The physical survival itself was difficult for doctors to explain. The rod had passed through areas of the brain considered critical for higher reasoning and personality. Yet Gage remained conscious and physically functional. However, those who knew him began to report changes that were difficult to ignore. Before the accident, co-workers described him as responsible and reliable. After his recovery, observers reported a noticeable shift in his behavior. Harlow wrote that Gage had become impatient, unpredictable, and often profane. He struggled to maintain steady employment and was described by some acquaintances as impulsive and emotionally unstable. His employers at the railroad reportedly declined to reinstate him, stating that he was no longer Gage. These behavioral changes became central to the medical interests surrounding the case. Throughout the mid-19th century, scientists were debating whether different regions of the brain controlled specific mental functions. Gage's injury appeared to provide rare physical evidence linking the frontal lobes to personality and decision-making. Yet even as the case gained attention, many questions remained unanswered. Medical records from the time were limited. Imaging technology did not exist. Doctors could only rely on external observations and physical examinations. Some accounts of Gage's personality change came from secondhand reports recorded years later. Others suggested the behavioral differences may have been exaggerated over time as the case entered scientific discussion. After recovering sufficiently, Gage left Vermont and spent several years traveling. Historical records indicate that he worked briefly as a stagecoach driver in Chile, a job that required concentration, balance, and the ability to manage teams of horses across difficult terrain. This detail later raised questions among historians and neurologists. The role demanded discipline and coordination, qualities some reports suggested he had lost. In 1859, approximately 11 years after the accident, Gage died in San Francisco following a series of epileptic seizures. He was 36 years old. Years later, Dr. Harlow arranged for Gage's skull and the original tamping iron to be exhumed and preserved for scientific study. Both artifacts are now held by the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School. Modern researchers have used scans of the skull to reconstruct the path of the rod through Gage's brain. These reconstructions suggest the iron passed through areas associated with emotional regulation and decision-making. Even with modern analysis, however, the case continues to raise unresolved questions. How Gage remained conscious immediately after the injury remains difficult to fully explain. Why the damage did not cause instant death or complete neurological collapse is still debated. Some aspects of his personality change rely on limited documentation that historians cannot fully verify. More than a century later, the case of Phineas Gage remains one of the most unusual medical survivals ever recorded. A man survived a catastrophic brain injury that should have been fatal, walked away from the scene, spoke with doctors, and lived for more than a decade afterward, leaving behind a story that still challenges how science understands the human brain. The village where everyone suddenly fell asleep. In early 2013, residents of the small village of Kalachi in northern Kazakhstan began experiencing an unusual and unsettling medical phenomenon. Kalachi sits in the Akmola region, a quiet settlement of fewer than 700 people surrounded by open steppe and scattered farmland. For decades, it had been a largely unremarkable rural community, known mostly for its aging population and its proximity to the abandoned uranium mining town of Krasnogorsk, located a few kilometers away. In March of that year, the first reported incident occurred when several villagers suddenly fell into deep sleep without warning. Witnesses later told local doctors that the individuals had been engaged in normal daily activities before becoming extremely drowsy. Some collapsed where they stood. Others managed to lie down before losing consciousness. The episodes were not brief. In many cases, the affected residents remained asleep for hours or even several days. When they finally woke, they reported intense confusion, headaches, and partial memory loss. At first, local physicians believed the cases were isolated medical events, but over the following weeks, more residents experienced identical symptoms. The pattern quickly spread. Teachers fell asleep in classrooms. Workers lost consciousness while performing routine tasks. Several children reportedly collapsed during school lessons. The incidents occurred at different times of day and affected people of different ages. According to regional health officials, by the end of 2013, more than 40 residents had experienced at least one episode. Some individuals suffered repeated attacks. One of the earliest documented cases involved a man named Viktor Kazachenko, a local farmer who reportedly fell asleep while walking through the village center. According to medical records later referenced by Kazakh news agencies, Kazachenko remained unconscious for nearly 6 days. When he woke, he could not remember how he had fallen asleep or what had happened during the previous week. Doctors in nearby hospitals began documenting additional symptoms among patients. Many reported vivid hallucinations while asleep or immediately after waking. Some described seeing animals or strangers inside their homes that later proved not to exist. Others experienced disorientation so severe they could not recognize family members. In several cases, patients temporarily lost the ability to walk or speak clearly for hours after regaining consciousness. Concern quickly spread beyond the village. Regional authorities sent medical teams from the city of Kokshetau to investigate. Blood tests, neurological exams, and toxicology screenings were conducted on dozens of residents. The initial results showed no obvious infectious disease. Radiation levels in the village were measured due to the nearby uranium mines, but early readings appeared within acceptable limits. Despite the lack of clear evidence, Suspicion soon focused on the abandoned mining operations outside Kalachi. The nearby town of Krasnogorsk had once been a center for uranium extraction during the Soviet era. When the mines closed in the 1990s, most residents left. Large sections of the underground tunnels remained sealed but not fully monitored. Some experts speculated that gases trapped in the mine shafts might be escaping into the surrounding environment. Others suggested groundwater contamination could be responsible. Throughout 2014, the incidents continued. The number of reported cases rose to more than 100. In some households, multiple family members were affected. Teachers reported students suddenly becoming unresponsive during lessons. Local police officers were reportedly called to assist when several residents fell asleep in public areas and could not be awakened for hours. Medical specialists from Kazakhstan's National Scientific Center for Medical Problems traveled to Kalachi to conduct further research. Teams installed environmental monitoring equipment and collected air samples across the village. Some investigators began testing for elevated levels of carbon monoxide or other toxic gases that might cause sudden unconsciousness. Early results, however, failed to produce a consistent explanation. In one report published by Kazakh authorities in 2015, researchers noted unusually high concentrations of carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons in some underground areas near the abandoned mines. The theory suggested that gases accumulating in old tunnels could occasionally rise to the surface under certain weather conditions. Yet the evidence remained incomplete. The gas levels measured within the village itself fluctuated and did not always correspond with the timing of sleep episodes. Other medical specialists proposed a different explanation. Some suggested the phenomenon could be a rare form of mass psychogenic illness triggered by anxiety or environmental stress. However, many physicians rejected that theory because the patients showed clear neurological symptoms during examination, including impaired coordination and abnormal brain activity patterns recorded during sleep monitoring. By late 2014, the situation had become widely known in Kazakhstan's national media. Journalists began referring to Kalachi as the Sleepy Hollow Village. Government officials announced a relocation program offering residents the opportunity to move to nearby communities. Several families accepted the offer and left the area permanently. Even so, the medical mystery remained unresolved. In some cases, people who moved away from Kalachi reported that their symptoms stopped completely. Others experienced at least one additional sleep episode after relocation, creating further confusion about the possible cause. Investigators continued studying environmental samples, mine ventilation patterns, and regional geological data. Yet no single factor explained every recorded case. Medical files compiled during the investigation described a condition unlike typical sleep disorders or known poisoning events. Patients often entered sudden unconsciousness without warning and remained asleep far longer than normal human sleep cycles. Some could not be awakened even with strong stimuli. Others woke abruptly with no clear explanation for how the episode had ended. By 2016, most of Kalachi's remaining residents had either relocated or adapted to the uncertainty. The frequency of new cases declined as the population decreased, though a handful of unexplained incidents were still reported in regional medical records. Today, the village remains partially inhabited, quiet, and largely overlooked. The abandoned uranium mines still sit a short distance away, sealed but not completely understood. Years of medical investigation produced several possible explanations, but no definitive answer. More than 100 people fell asleep without warning, sometimes for days at a time, in a place where routine life had once continued without interruption, leaving behind a medical mystery that has never been fully explained. The woman who felt no pain. In 2013, a woman from the Scottish Highlands visited Regmore Hospital in Inverness for what doctors believed would be a routine orthopedic procedure. The patient, a retired schoolteacher named Jo Cameron, was in her mid-60s. Medical staff preparing her for surgery noticed something unusual in her chart. During previous treatments, Cameron had repeatedly declined standard levels of pain medication. According to her records, she rarely reported discomfort even after injuries that normally caused severe pain. Nurses initially assumed this was simply a matter of personal tolerance. Many patients describe pain differently. But Cameron's history contained several incidents that raised questions. Years earlier, she had broken her arm without realizing it. On another occasion, she suffered a serious hand injury while cooking, but did not notice the damage until she saw blood on the floor. According to her own account, pain had never been a significant part of her life. Cameron reportedly told doctors that she believed her experience was normal. She assumed other people reacted the same way but simply complained more about discomfort. During the 2013 procedure, surgeons expected Cameron to require strong anesthetic support. Instead, the surgical team observed that she appeared unusually calm, even as medications wore off. Her recovery was equally unexpected. While most patients reported significant post-operative pain, Cameron described only mild pressure near the surgical site. Doctors initially considered whether the effect might be psychological. Some patients demonstrate high tolerance due to emotional resilience or stress responses. However, Cameron's medical background suggested something different. Over the years, she had undergone several medical treatments that typically caused prolonged pain during recovery. In each case, she reported minimal discomfort and required little or no opioid medication. Even more unusual was her emotional profile. According to interviews later documented by researchers, Cameron rarely experienced anxiety or prolonged fear. She described herself as consistently calm, even during situations that most people would find stressful. Family members confirmed this observation. Her husband reportedly told doctors that she rarely panicked and seemed to recover quickly from emotionally difficult situations. The unusual pattern eventually attracted the attention of researchers at University College London and the University of Oxford. In 2015, a team led by geneticist Dr. James Cox began studying Cameron's case more closely. Blood samples and DNA analysis were collected in order to examine whether a rare genetic mutation might explain her condition. The research revealed an unexpected discovery. Cameron carried a mutation affecting a gene known as FAAH, which plays a role in regulating pain perception and emotional response. The gene normally helps break down molecules involved in signaling pain and stress within the nervous system. In Cameron's case, researchers found that the gene was partially inactive. This meant the molecules responsible for reducing pain signals remained active longer than usual in her body. As a result, her nervous system appeared to process physical injury differently from most people. Further investigation uncovered an additional genetic feature. Cameron possessed a previously undocumented mutation near the FAAH gene, in a region scientists began referring to as FAAH-OUT. Researchers believe this mutation might interfere with how the main gene functions, further reducing pain signaling pathways in her nervous system. The findings were published in a scientific journal in 2019 and attracted attention within the medical community. On paper, the genetic explanation appeared convincing, yet the discovery raised new questions rather than closing the case. Doctors who examined Cameron noted that the mutation alone did not fully explain the range of effects she displayed. Other individuals with similar genetic variations had been identified, but their symptoms were not identical. Some still experienced moderate pain. Others reported anxiety or normal emotional reactions to stress. Cameron's condition appeared unusually extreme. Her medical history also included rapid wound healing and reduced scarring. According to clinical observations, injuries that normally required extended recovery often healed quickly. Researchers suspected this might also be linked to the altered signaling molecules controlled by the FAAH system, but the mechanism remained unclear. During interviews conducted as part of the study, Cameron described several incidents that illustrated the risks of her condition. In one case, she reportedly burned her arm severely while cooking, but continued working until a family member noticed the injury hours later. On another occasion, she fractured her hip after a fall, but did not immediately seek medical attention because she assumed the discomfort was minor. Doctors noted that the absence of pain, while seemingly beneficial, could create serious health dangers. Pain normally functions as a warning system. Without it, injuries can go unnoticed until complications develop. Cameron herself acknowledged this in interviews. She reportedly told researchers that she had learned to rely on visual signs of injury rather than physical sensation. "I have to look for damage," she said in one recorded statement. "Otherwise, I wouldn't know." Scientists studying the case hoped it might lead to new treatments for chronic pain. If the genetic pathways responsible for Cameron's condition could be replicated safely, it might allow doctors to develop medications that reduce pain without the addictive effects of opioids. Yet translating the discovery into practical treatment has proven difficult. The human pain system involves complex interactions between genes, nerves, and brain chemistry. Altering one part of the system can produce unpredictable side effects. Cameron's condition also involved psychological factors that researchers still struggle to explain. Brain imaging studies suggested that her emotional responses to fear and stress were unusually muted. Regions of the brain associated with threat perception appeared less reactive during controlled experiments. Scientists could not determine whether this effect was directly linked to the genetic mutation or developed over a lifetime of living without normal pain signals. Even decades after the first documented incidents, many aspects of Cameron's condition remain uncertain. Genetic mutations associated with pain perception are rare, but they have been documented before. What makes her case unusual is the combination of nearly absent pain, reduced anxiety, and accelerated healing. The exact biological mechanism connecting these features has not been fully mapped. Today, Jo Cameron continues to live quietly in Scotland, while researchers periodically revisit the case for additional study. Her DNA samples remain part of ongoing neurological research programs. The data has expanded scientific understanding of how the human body processes pain, but it has not produced a complete explanation. For doctors who encountered the case, one fact remains difficult to ignore. A woman lived her entire life with injuries, surgeries, and physical trauma that most people would find unbearable, yet her nervous system responded with almost complete silence, leaving scientists with a rare medical phenomenon that modern research still cannot fully explain. The boy who survived a fall from the stratosphere. On January 26, 1972, JT Flight 367 departed from Stockholm, Sweden, on a scheduled route to Belgrade with several stops along the way. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 operated by Yugoslav Airlines. On board were 23 passengers and 5 crew members. Among the crew was a 22-year-old flight attendant named Vesna Vulovic, a relatively new employee who had joined the airline only months earlier. The flight proceeded normally during the early stages of the journey. After departing from Copenhagen, the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of approximately 33,000 feet as it crossed the airspace over Czechoslovakia. At 4:01 p.m., air traffic controllers monitoring the flight suddenly lost contact with the aircraft. Moments later, witnesses on the ground reported hearing a distant explosion. Radar signals disappeared almost instantly. Investigators later concluded that the plane had broken apart in midair after a powerful explosion in the baggage compartment. The aircraft disintegrated over the mountainous region near the village of Srbska Kamenica, in what is now the Czech Republic. Debris scattered across several kilometers of forest and steep hillside. Search teams arriving at the scene expected to find no survivors. The altitude alone made survival appear impossible. Yet among the wreckage, rescue workers discovered something that would later become one of the most unusual aviation survival cases ever documented. Inside a section of the aircraft fuselage, partially wedged between food carts and pieces of structure, they found Vesna Vulovic alive. She was unconscious but breathing. The section of fuselage had fallen along a heavily forested slope covered with deep snow, which investigators later believed may have slowed the descent and cushioned the impact. According to official reports, Vulovic had suffered multiple injuries. Her skull was fractured, both legs were broken. Several vertebrae were crushed, leaving her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Internal bleeding was extensive. Despite these injuries, she remained alive when rescuers reached her. A local resident named Bruno Honka, a former military medic who lived nearby, was reportedly among the first to reach the crash site. Honke later told investigators that he heard cries while searching through the wreckage and followed the sound until he located the damaged fuselage section. He provided first aid and remained with Vulovic until emergency crews arrived. She was transported to a hospital in Prague, where doctors initially doubted she would survive the night. According to medical reports later released by Yugoslav authorities, Vulovic remained in a coma for several days. When she eventually regained consciousness, she had no memory of the explosion or the fall. Her earliest recollection was waking in the hospital surrounded by medical staff. Doctors continued treating her injuries for months. She underwent multiple surgeries and long periods of rehabilitation. Despite the severity of her injuries, Vulovic gradually regained mobility. Within a year, she was able to walk again with only minor limitations. The survival quickly attracted international attention. Aviation experts began analyzing how a human being could survive a fall from such altitude. Initial investigations focused on the position of the fuselage section during descent. Some engineers suggested that the structure may have remained partially intact for several moments as it fell, reducing terminal velocity. Others pointed to the steep, forested terrain and heavy snow as factors that might have absorbed some of the impact energy. Even with these possibilities, the physics remained difficult to fully explain. A fall from over 10,000 meters typically results in impact forces far beyond what the human body can survive. The Yugoslav government officially attributed the explosion to a bomb placed in the baggage compartment, possibly linked to political extremism active at the time. However, the precise sequence of events during the aircraft's final moments remained unclear. Investigators recovered fragments of the fuselage and analyzed the debris pattern across the mountainside. While evidence supported the bomb theory, many details about the breakup of the aircraft could not be reconstructed with certainty. For medical researchers, Vulovic's survival raised additional questions. Doctors studying her injuries noted that she had extremely low blood pressure at the time of the incident, a condition that may have caused her to lose consciousness before the fuselage struck the ground. Some specialists suggested this might have prevented her body from entering a state of panic or muscle tension during impact, potentially reducing internal trauma. Others considered the possibility that the narrow space between the food carts and fuselage walls had effectively secured her body during the fall. In this scenario, the surrounding structure may have absorbed the majority of the impact forces. However, investigators acknowledged that no experiment could replicate the exact combination of circumstances. Over the following years, Vulovic became an unusual symbol of survival. The Guinness Book of World Records later recognized her as the person who survived the highest fall without a parachute. She returned briefly to work for the airline in a desk position, but never resumed flying. Despite the attention surrounding her survival, Vulovic herself rarely discussed the event in detail. Interviews conducted years later showed that she remembered nothing about the explosion, the fall, or the rescue. The entire incident existed in her life only through medical records and witness accounts. In 2016, decades after the crash, new questions emerged when several Czech journalists suggested the aircraft might have been flying at a lower altitude than originally reported. According to their investigation, radar data from the time could indicate the plane had descended significantly before breaking apart. If true, the fall would still have been catastrophic, but potentially less extreme than the widely reported altitude of 33,000 feet. Aviation historians examined the claims, but found the available records incomplete. Many documents from the original investigation had been archived or lost following the political changes in Eastern Europe after the Cold War. As a result, the exact altitude at which the aircraft disintegrated remains debated among researchers. Even if the aircraft had descended somewhat, the survival would still represent an extraordinary event. The combination of a mid-air explosion, structural breakup, uncontrolled descent, and a single survivor continues to challenge simple explanation. Vesna Vulovic lived until 2016, carrying the distinction of surviving an accident that killed everyone else on board. For investigators and scientists who have studied the case, one fact remains difficult to fully explain. A human being fell from the sky inside a shattered piece of aircraft and lived to tell the story, leaving behind an aviation mystery that still raises questions decades later. The mysterious dancing plague of 1518. In the summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg was part of the Holy Roman Empire, located along the Rhine River in what is now eastern France. At the time, Strasbourg was a densely populated urban center surrounded by farmland and trade routes. Historical records from the city council describe a period of intense hardship. Several years of poor harvests had driven food prices upward, disease outbreaks were common, and the region had recently endured waves of political tension and religious uncertainty. Against this background of stress and instability, a strange series of events began in mid-July that would later become known as the Dancing Plague. According to municipal records preserved in Strasbourg's archives, the first known case occurred around July 14, 1518. A woman identified in some documents as Frau Trofea reportedly stepped into a narrow street near her home and began dancing. Witnesses later told local authorities that the movements appeared uncontrolled. She twisted, stepped, and spun for hours without stopping. At first, the event attracted little attention. Strange behavior was not entirely uncommon during periods of social stress, but by the end of the first day, observers noted that she had continued moving for hours with no sign of fatigue. The following day, the situation worsened. Trophea reportedly returned to the street and resumed dancing again. According to a chronicle written by Strasbourg physician Paracelsus several years later, she danced almost continuously for days. Her feet became swollen and bruised, yet she did not appear able to stop. Within a week, several other residents began displaying the same behavior. One man reportedly joined her in the street and began moving in a similar uncontrolled rhythm. Soon afterward, more people followed. By late July, local authorities recorded dozens of individuals dancing in public spaces throughout the city. None appeared to be performing for entertainment. Witnesses described their movements as frantic and repetitive, sometimes lasting for hours without rest. City officials initially believed the behavior might fade if ignored. Instead, the number of affected residents increased rapidly. Municipal council records indicate that by early August, more than 100 people were participating in the strange activity. Some collapsed from exhaustion only to resume dancing once they recovered consciousness. Several individuals reportedly danced until their feet bled through their shoes. Physicians and religious leaders were called in to determine the cause. At the time, medical knowledge relied heavily on theories of bodily humors and spiritual imbalance. Some doctors believed the dancers were suffering from what they described as overheated blood. According to this theory, excessive internal heat caused the body to move uncontrollably. Based on this explanation, the city council made a controversial decision. Rather than attempting to stop the dancing, our authorities believed the victims needed to continue moving until the condition passed naturally. In response, officials arranged for musicians to play in public squares. Temporary wooden stages were constructed so the dancers would have space to move. Professional dancers were even hired to accompany the afflicted individuals, with the intention of helping them release the supposed illness through continued motion. Historical documents suggest this decision had the opposite effect. Instead of calming the situation, the presence of music and public attention appeared to encourage more participants. The number of dancers continued to grow. Reports written by city scribes describe groups of exhausted individuals swaying and stumbling through the streets for hours at a time. Several accounts indicate that some participants eventually collapsed and died, though the exact number of fatalities remains uncertain. Some chronicles mention heart attacks and strokes among those who had danced continuously for days. The city council eventually abandoned the earlier approach. By late August, authorities ordered the musicians to stop playing and banned public dancing within the city. The afflicted individuals were instead transported to a nearby shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a Christian martyr sometimes associated with neurological disorders. According to church records, the dancers were given red shoes and instructed to perform ritual prayers in the hope that the saint would cure them. Shortly afterward, the outbreak began to decline. By early September, the number of active cases had dropped significantly. Within weeks, the dancing epidemic appeared to disappear as suddenly as it had begun. What remained was a collection of reports, council documents, and personal chronicles describing a phenomenon that no one fully understood. Over the centuries, historians and medical researchers have attempted to reconstruct what happened in Strasbourg during that summer. Several theories have been proposed. One suggestion involves ergot poisoning, a condition caused by toxic fungi that grow on rye grain. Consumption of contaminated bread can lead to convulsions and hallucinations. However, many researchers have argued that ergot poisoning does not typically produce coordinated dancing movements lasting for days. Another explanation focuses on psychological stress. Strasbourg in 1518 was experiencing severe social pressure. Food shortages, disease, and religious anxiety had created an environment of widespread fear. Some historians suggest the outbreak may have been a form of mass psychogenic illness, where extreme stress spreads physical symptoms through social influence. In this interpretation, the dancers may not have been consciously choosing their actions. Instead, they could have been responding to a collective psychological trigger within the community. Yet even this explanation leaves unanswered questions. Mass psychogenic illness can produce unusual behavior, but the scale and duration described in the Strasbourg records remain unusual. Some individuals reportedly danced for several days with only brief interruptions for sleep or collapse. Surviving medical accounts also describe symptoms such as hallucinations, severe exhaustion, and disorientation that do not fit neatly into a single diagnosis. Modern historians have studied the surviving records carefully, including municipal financial documents that confirm payments for musicians and construction of dance stages. These administrative records support the idea that the city council genuinely believed dancing itself was part of the treatment. Despite centuries of analysis, no single explanation has fully accounted for every detail recorded during the outbreak. What began with one woman moving alone in a street grew into a citywide phenomenon involving hundreds of people. It lasted for weeks, caused injuries and possible deaths, and ended without a clear medical resolution. Today, the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the strangest documented behavioral outbreaks in European history, a case in which an entire community watched as ordinary people lost control of their bodies and danced for reasons that science still cannot completely explain. The man who woke up speaking a different language. In May of 2016, a 31-year-old man named Ben McMahon was admitted to a hospital in Melbourne, Australia, after a serious car accident on a suburban road outside the city. According to police reports, McMahon had been driving home late in the evening when his vehicle collided with another car at an intersection. Emergency responders found him unconscious behind the wheel with significant head trauma. He was transported by ambulance to Royal Melbourne Hospital and placed in intensive care. Doctors determined that he had suffered a traumatic brain injury and immediately placed him into a medically induced coma in order to stabilize swelling in the brain. For several days, his condition remained uncertain. Medical staff monitored neurological activity while his family waited for signs of recovery. McMahon's parents later told journalists that doctors warned them memory loss or long-term cognitive damage was possible. Nearly a week after the accident, physicians gradually reduced the sedative medications. As McMahon regained consciousness, nurses expected him to speak English, his native language. Instead, something unexpected happened. According to hospital staff, the first words he spoke were not English at all. The sounds he produced appeared to be Mandarin Chinese. Nurses initially assumed the speech was confused or fragmented. But when a Chinese-speaking staff member was brought into the room, the nurse realized the patient was forming recognizable words and sentences. McMahon was reportedly asking where he was and why he was in the hospital. The Mandarin was not fluent, but it was clear enough to be understood. For McMahon's family, the moment was deeply confusing. They knew he had studied Mandarin briefly during high school several years earlier, but only at a beginner level. According to his parents, he had never spoken the language comfortably in conversation and had not used it in years. Yet, during the first hours after waking from the coma, Mandarin appeared to come naturally to him, while English seemed inaccessible. Doctors documented the behavior carefully. When hospital staff attempted to speak with him in English, McMahon reportedly struggled to respond. His sentences were slow and uncertain. When addressed in Mandarin by a nurse or translator, however, his responses were faster and more coherent. Neurologists monitoring his recovery began considering a rare condition known as foreign language syndrome, sometimes associated with traumatic brain injuries. The disorder can temporarily alter language processing in the brain, occasionally causing a patient to access secondary languages differently than before the injury. However, most documented cases involve languages the patient already speaks fluently. McMahon's situation appeared different. By most accounts, his Mandarin ability prior to the accident had been limited to basic classroom instruction. Within days of regaining consciousness, his language abilities began shifting again. English gradually returned, though it initially carried traces of unusual pronunciation patterns. Mandarin remained present but began fading as his brain recovered. Doctors performed neurological scans to examine the regions of the brain involved in language processing. Imaging showed evidence of trauma in areas near the left hemisphere, particularly regions associated with speech production and comprehension. However, the damage did not clearly explain why Mandarin had temporarily become more accessible than English. Over the following weeks, McMahon underwent speech therapy and cognitive testing as part of his rehabilitation. During these sessions, therapists recorded how his language abilities changed from day to day. At times, he could switch between English and Mandarin with relative ease. At other times, he struggled with both languages, pausing to search for basic words. Neurologists studying the case suggested that the injury may have disrupted the brain's normal language hierarchy. In many bilingual individuals, the brain organizes languages according to familiarity and frequency of use. Trauma can interfere with these pathways, temporarily reshuffling which language systems are most accessible. Yet this explanation raised further questions. McMahon had not used Mandarin regularly for years. Most bilingual patients who develop similar symptoms revert to a second language they speak fluently. In McMahon's case, the language that surfaced first was one he had only studied briefly as a teenager. Several weeks after the accident, journalists learned about the case through local hospital staff and requested interviews with McMahon. In one televised interview conducted during his recovery, he demonstrated the unusual shift himself. When asked questions in Mandarin, he responded with relatively smooth sentences, though his accent remained noticeable. When switching to English, he occasionally paused as if searching for the correct phrasing. Neurologists observing the case emphasized that brain injuries can produce temporary reorganization in neural networks. Memory, language, and personality are distributed across multiple regions of the brain. Damage in one area can force other regions to compensate, sometimes producing unexpected behaviors. However, the precise neurological pathway responsible for McMahon's temporary Mandarin fluency remained unclear. Over the next several months, his English gradually returned to normal. Mandarin ability declined as the recovery progressed. By the end of the year, McMahon reported that he could still understand basic Mandarin phrases, but no longer spoke it comfortably. The language that had briefly dominated his speech after the coma seemed to recede as his brain stabilized. Researchers studying rare neurological conditions occasionally refer to cases like McMahon's when discussing the complexity of language processing in the human brain. Despite advances in brain imaging and cognitive science, scientists still struggle to map exactly how multiple languages are stored and accessed within neural networks. Some specialists believe the injury may have temporarily suppressed dominant language pathways while leaving weaker memory traces more accessible. Others suggest the effect could have been linked to memory reconsolidation during recovery from coma, a process that remains poorly understood. Medical records from the hospital confirm the timeline of events, but they offer no definitive explanation. For a brief period after a traumatic brain injury, a man who had barely used Mandarin for years woke up speaking it as if it were the most accessible language in his mind. As his brain healed, the ability faded, leaving behind a neurological puzzle that continues to raise questions about how the human brain stores language and why, under certain conditions, those hidden pathways can suddenly emerge without warning. The lake that turned deadly overnight. On the evening of August 21st, 1986, life in the rural villages surrounding Lake Nos in northwestern Cameroon followed its usual rhythm. The area was remote and quiet, located within the Oku volcanic field near the Nigerian border. Small farming communities were scattered across the hills and valleys around the lake. Families tended cattle, grew crops, and relied on the calm waters of the crater lake that sat within the bowl of an ancient volcanic explosion. Few residents had reason to believe the lake itself posed any danger. Shortly after nightfall, something unusual occurred. Several witnesses later reported hearing a low rumbling sound coming from the direction of the lake. Others described what they believed was a distant explosion, though no fire or visible eruption was seen. Within minutes, an invisible cloud began spreading outward from the lake basin. The gas moved silently down the surrounding valleys, hugging the ground and flowing through nearby villages as the night air cooled. People sleeping in their homes were the first to be affected. Many were found the next morning exactly where they had gone to sleep. Others collapsed while attempting to flee. In the village of Nios, located only a few kilometers from the water's edge, entire households were discovered lifeless. Livestock lay scattered across fields and roads. Chickens, goats, and cattle had died where they stood. By sunrise on August 22nd, the scale of the disaster began to emerge. Survivors from nearby areas who approached the villages described a scene of complete silence. In many homes, cooking fires had burned out overnight while their owners lay motionless nearby. No signs of violence were visible. There were no burns, no injuries, and no obvious explanation for what had happened. Local officials quickly contacted authorities in the regional capital. Medical teams and government investigators arrived within days. What they encountered was one of the most unusual environmental disasters ever recorded. More than 1,700 people had died during the night, along with thousands of animals. Entire communities had been wiped out without warning. Early investigators struggled to determine the cause. At first, rumors circulated about chemical warfare or poison released intentionally into the area. Cameroon was politically stable at the time, but the scale of the deaths raised immediate suspicion. Doctors performing examinations on victims noted that many showed signs consistent with suffocation. There were no signs of trauma or infectious disease. Blood samples revealed unusually high levels of dissolved carbon dioxide in some tissues. As investigators turned their attention toward Lake Nyos itself, they began noticing additional clues. The water near the center of the lake appeared discolored. Vegetation around the shoreline showed signs of disturbance. Survivors reported that the air near the lake had smelled unusual that night, though the descriptions varied. Scientists soon proposed a theory involving a rare natural phenomenon known as a limnic eruption. Lake Nyos sits within a volcanic crater formed thousands of years earlier. Beneath the lake floor, volcanic gases slowly seep upward through cracks in the earth. Over time, carbon dioxide dissolves into the deep layers of the lake water under immense pressure. Normally, the gas remains trapped beneath the surface because the lake's water layers remain stable. But under certain conditions, that balance can collapse. If deep water suddenly rises, the dissolved gas can erupt violently from the lake, similar to the way carbon dioxide escapes when a bottle of soda is shaken and opened. In the case of Lake Nyos, scientists believe such a release occurred during the night of August 21st. An enormous volume of carbon dioxide surged upward and spilled over the lake's rim, forming a dense cloud that flowed downhill through nearby villages. Because carbon dioxide is heavier than air, it displaced oxygen close to the ground. Anyone breathing the gas would have lost consciousness within seconds. The explanation fit many of the observations. However, several important questions remained unresolved. Investigators could not determine exactly what triggered the eruption. Some scientists suggested that a landslide into the lake might have disturbed the deep layers of water. Others proposed that heavy rainfall or temperature changes could have destabilized the gas buildup. Yet no clear evidence confirmed any specific trigger. Geological surveys conducted after the disaster found that the lake still contained large amounts of dissolved carbon dioxide. This discovery alarmed scientists who realized the same event could potentially happen again. In response, international teams developed a system of vertical pipes designed to slowly release gas from the lake's depths in a controlled manner. These degassing systems were installed during the 1990s and continue operating today. Even with these precautions, the disaster left a lasting mystery about how such an enormous release occurred so suddenly. Witnesses from villages farther away described hearing a loud blast that night, suggesting the eruption may have been violent. Others reported feeling a sudden gust of cold air moving through the valleys before losing consciousness. Yet survivors closest to the lake often remembered nothing at all. They simply woke hours later surrounded by silence and devastation. Scientists studying the event have confirmed that limnic eruptions are extremely rare. Only one similar disaster had ever been documented before, at Lake Manoon in Cameroon 2 years earlier, where 37 people died under similar circumstances. That earlier event had not yet been fully understood when the catastrophe at Lake Nyos occurred. Today, the quiet waters of Lake Nyos appear calm again, reflecting the surrounding mountains as they did before the disaster. Yet beneath the surface, the geological processes that caused the deadly gas release have never been completely understood. Investigators believe they know what happened, but the precise chain of events that turned an ordinary crater lake into a silent cloud of suffocation overnight remains one of the most unsettling environmental mysteries ever recorded. Thank you for staying until the end, where stories fade but questions remain, reminding us that time quietly buries fragments of truth in shadow and silence, and some answers reveal themselves only to those who listen carefully to what history never explains.